Thank you, everybody, for coming right after lunch. I am going to try and keep you entertained. So my name is Brenda, as she said. I am the CEO of Teller, but in my prior life, I was an economist, and I worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics as producing some of the principal federal economic indicators, such as the Producer Price Index and the employment numbers that you see every month. And so with that in mind, I think the last few years, mostly crypto has been really focused on disintermediating the financial sector. And I think we need to expand our reach to actually disintermediate more than that, including data that has been forever centralized, produced in a centralized way. Now we have a technology to be able to produce it in a more decentralized way, in a more transparent way. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this quote, but it's by Ben Franklin. He was one of the founding fathers of the US. And I agree with this, I'm sorry. Which way? Well, I agree. This is actually not his quote. His quote actually says taxes, except death and taxes. So, but in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. And I went ahead and made a correction to that because, as we know, if you have enough money, especially in the US, you can probably get away with not paying taxes. But inflation, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how poor or rich you are, you face inflation. And that is something that we cannot escape. This is the official definition for the CPI. And basically all it is, it's the government attempting to measure how much you're spending today for the same items that you consume, and then how much you would pay for them later, and sort of measuring your purchasing power and how much your standard of living changes over time. And this number is very, very important because it only comes out once a month, but it has a very direct effect on our pockets as consumers. And sometimes I don't think people make the connection that this really random number that the government publishes, it can be used for so many things, like actually adjusting how much money you get paid every year. In crypto, we probably don't have that many clauses for our wages, but in general, especially the government, they generally have a clause, an escalation clause for your wages that depend on the CPI. They also adjust government assistance payments to retirees and even retirees and other payments that they do to basically help the economy that are based, all of the changes for this are based on this very, very specific number. And they also do basically base their monetary policy on this number. Monetary policy affects us directly, not just in how we transact on every day, but also on the long term. Interest rates, specifically, if you're trying to buy a house in the US right now, I think the rates for buying a house are like 6 or 7%, when in 2021 it was 3%. And so they implement these changes to basically dissuade you from taking a loan and hopefully pulling in the money supply. And so this number is so important, but ultimately, we really don't have a way to check on it, really, right? There are some paid systems or paid ways of getting alternative numbers, but there's nothing publicly available. There is no transparency in the government. And the problem with that is that the CPI itself has a really, really muddied history. When the CPI was the first commissioned by the US government was after they implemented the Tariff Act of 1890, and it was an import tariff that was really high, and this was basically the Democrats fighting with the Republicans, and they commissioned this survey to try and figure out who was right about it and then probably play it out for the next election. And then in 1891, they started collecting the data, but they only collected data from white guys that were married and they lived in cities. That was it, that was the sample, nothing else. It took 50 years for the US government to actually start or include Blacks and Hispanic into the survey. And then it took another 40 years for them to actually change from a basket of specific goods, because let's be honest, so my background is Mexican, and so I eat a lot of tortillas. So that was probably not part of the basket of goods, right? So in 1978, they actually went from a specific basket of goods to categories to help with this bias that they purposely had introduced. And also, it's important to note that in 1941, when they actually included Blacks and Hispanic into the survey, they purposefully underrepresented those populations. And that was open and known. They've always been very open about their methodology. And over the years, the main criticisms for it have always been substitution bias, lacked inclusion of new items, and poorly measured changes in quality. And all of these have an effect on the index, but there's a lot of research and literature that have poured into that. What we don't really talk about as much is the conflict of interest that it exists between what is being produced by the government and what their policy or their government agendas might be. And this is very important because maybe we feel really comfortable about where we live and we really trust our governments. And honestly, having worked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for over a decade, I think everybody there really does try and create the best numbers possible. But it doesn't, you still need to have some sort of oversight. You can't just trust your government. That can change in any minute. And one very interesting example to me was in Argentina. They've always had some political unrest, but from 2007 to 2015, they were not undergoing war. They have ports, they have resources, and they were openly cooking their inflation numbers. They just would divide them they would only report a third of it. People obviously knew those numbers were wrong. Right? They knew what we're experiencing does not match what the government is doing. But it fit their agenda. Now we can go and get more loans from the IMF and the World Bank, and if it benefits a few people that are running the government. Another big example is Venezuela. I don't think we know what's going on there, but there has been a lot of research done on that by Alberto Cavallo and Bertolotti. And they actually went back and recreated the CPI for Argentina and Venezuela. And currently, they started with a project in MIT, then later became Inflación Verdadera for Argentina and Venezuela. And then now it's called Price Stats. It's still under a paywall, or they monetized it. Good for them. It would be great if they just let us see the data and actually make it more transparent. But they monetized it. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have the technology to make it better. Zimbabwe always goes, I guess, every time there's an election or a big policy thing. I think the last thing that they did in 2023, their government decided to base their policy on the previous methodology of the CPI instead of the new one. That just shows you how politicized this is and how basically we really have no alternative, right? Because it's just what they provide, and then we just trust it. Antitrust laws exist in the US to protect consumers. We know the monopolies lead to basically companies not doing anything better for their consumers, not improving their products, and it leads to just a detriment of the standard of living even in the long run. So if we have that to protect us from monopolies, and we know that they have a detrimental effect on us, then it only makes sense that we should have something that protects us against just having a monopoly of data by the government. And now we have open networks that can provide that necessary competition to make sure that we keep the government honest, instead of them trying to change the numbers based on their political agenda. So in order to do that, what I am proposing is this thing that I'm calling Decentralized fact-checked objectivity. And it's basically a framework that we can all use to leverage distributed networks to collect data in a decentralized way, to publish methodology in a decentralized way, and also to disclose who's funding the project. Because there's a lot of times that whoever is actually funding the research, including in universities, if the outcome or the conclusion is not what they expected, because they fund the research, we may never see that research, basically, because they funded, and they're like, we don't like it, we cannot use it for our marketing materials, instead of honestly being true to research, right? So if we do this, we follow this framework. Basically, it's super simple. If you want to do some research project, in my case, the CPI, you publish the specification on a DSP, or like IPFS or something like that, including the funding or the funding mechanism, or in this case, it's the common good. So that's how I would want to frame it. And then once you publish it, you go on chain, you register that hash of the address of the IPFS where this data is saved. And then you start incentivizing data collection. Then you collect and publish the raw data again on a DSP. And that's very important. It has to be the raw data, because then after you do whatever you need to do with your raw data, you can go back and actually publish your methodology on a DSP as well. Having the raw data and the methodology open and available to anybody, what this creates, it's an open peer review system that can actually keep you honest, right? And just make data actually better and beneficial for everybody. For the CPI, the very big thing for it, Alberto Cavallo and the research for Argentina and Venezuela, this research was done before the pandemic. So even when it was before the pandemic, they used online prices to recalculate the index, online prices and some local data they were able to get their hands on, and they were able to come out with pretty much the correct trend of what the government had reported. And that's how they came to the conclusion that the government was not actually cooking the numbers at the micro data level, but instead they would create the numbers and then just slash them by a third. And so, and with their research, they found out that online prices were actually very highly correlated with prices that they could find around each geographical area. So I'm basing this initial methodology on what their findings were, and now that the pandemic has happened, at least in the US, it has become even more prices are online about everything. Everybody uses Instacart. We can get all sorts of information online, including, and forever. We've always been able to get the MLB or the housing information, which is one of the biggest portions of income. Where your income goes is your housing and your food and your clothing. So all of these data can be collected on chain and be used to create a decentralized index. I know the data is not perfect, but the data is also not perfect for the government. We, as taxpayers, we basically pay for the government to have people that clean up the data, because people can misunderstand the survey, can try and provide bad data. But ultimately, when you have a broad range of data, when you have millions of data points, it's easier to catch and to exclude outliers, and that's what we pay the actual government to do, through our taxes, obviously. The government doesn't actually pay people to collect data. And that's because you don't want self-selection bias to be included in there. So it's the survey goes out, people provide the data for free, companies provide the data for free under a privacy agreement, basically. And that's because companies don't want their competitors to know too much about what they're doing. But honestly, at this point, everybody has online prices, and that's why Alberto Cavallo and Price Stats, that's their monetized system now, where I have been able to recreate these indexes on their own. So the next thing will be like classification of the data across the different platforms that it's collected, outlier detection methodology, and then using a really decentralized oracle, obviously, to provide the aggregated index back on chain. And the reason, so I'll obviously be using Teller, but one of the reasons you want something that is really censorship resistant is because as long as these numbers do not challenge the government's numbers, I think we'll be fine. As long as they act as a complement, that's fine. But I think the moment that it becomes that it diverges too much from the government, that could be an issue. Governments might not want to hear that and might want to censor that. So that's why it's super important that everything that we use to actually create this and make it transparent cannot, the team can go away and the protocol can still function as long as somebody's willing to put, a tip on chain to incentivize people to, to pay the gas. And obviously for data scrapers, you have to create them and maintain. Once they're created, it's more maintenance. And maybe we can, do the maintenance with the AI in the future. But it's a very simple system. Basically, it is 3 smart contracts interacting with each other. The main contract where all the registrations happen for registering the survey or registering the research. Then you get a research ID, and then registering the methodology that you use. And then each research, so for the CPI, it would have its own contract that is sort of linked by the research ID, and then all the information is just submitted to that CPI contract. And then when we want it aggregated, we just go tip Teller, and Teller makes sure that somebody, their network of data reporters aggregates the data, reports it on chain, and then it's available for everybody to use, just like the CPI is available for anybody to use once the government publishes it. Then we also have a small aspect that, to guarantee some sort of quality, and to grow quality into the system. So there's going to be a provider reputation system that is going to be based on the ratio of the data that they commit. There's a commit review scheme here just to incentivize or to disincentivize mirroring, but it's a function of the commit review ratio as well as the data quality. So how many outliers they were able, if their data is full of outliers and it's just really bad data, then their reputation is going to be lower. And I'm still taking feedback on this. If you guys think of anything else that I can use, I got some ideas yesterday about using this website that keeps a historical state of the blockchain. And so we could use that off-chain to do a measure of how good their data was or how good their data scraper was. So that the CPI would be the first thing that I would try. And then the next index will be the Big Mac index. And this would be actually the data. I would want to collect it on chain because it's not as big as the CPI. The CPI, if you want to collect lots and lots of data points, you're going to need a DSP. You're going to need a place to put it because it's just too much to handle for the blockchain. But for the Big Mac index, you can actually collect that data for a specific geographic area. And if you collect, the minimum in statistical terms is always like 30. But if you collect at least 100, you can come up with a pretty good number. And if the research is small enough that you can actually collect the data on chain, that's what you would want to do. Because once the data is on chain, if you disagree with my methodology, by all means, you have the raw data. Go and register methodology number 2 for the CPI, explain your rationale behind it, and tip the Teller data reporters to go aggregate it and report it on chain. And this way, it creates a really robust way of interpreting this data. And also, it keeps us all honest because it's an open peer review. If you disagree with my methodology, that is okay. Like, we can just clean it up. We can make it better as a community. And I have 1 more minute. We have the tech to create alternative economic measures to those provided by the governments to ensure their changes are actually neutral and not for any political agenda. And I think we are at a point in time for crypto that we need to start not just thinking about how we can make money and disintermediate finance, but how can we actually create things that are necessary for an economy independently of governments as well. So with that, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer any.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for your talk. And yeah, as she said, does anyone have any questions in the audience? Everyone down there?
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I have a question about the AI classification system you mentioned, just if you can give more color around that, and also the incentivization mechanism you use for the protocol.
Yes. So there's two incentives going on here. There's going to be the first incentive is actually the contributors that initially, unfortunately, or until I get enough funding, it's going to be my team. But it's supposed to be sort of like a DAO. For the contributors, it's going to be reputation-based for what, they develop the scrapers and whatnot. Once the scrapers are developed, then that's just an ongoing maintenance that it's just going to be the DAO sort of distributing some funds. I would not, at this point, I don't think I want a token. I would want just, you as a community, you contribute, and that becomes the money pot that goes to that. Then there's the other incentive mechanism that goes to actually incentivizing the Oracle to aggregate the data and provide it back on chain. And for that would be part of those funds. And the way that I see it, and honestly, I am still working those kinks out, is if you as a community really believe that your government is not doing a good job, this is where you would make your voice heard. So it is a common good. I realize that it's going to be really hard to just fund, and you don't fund, but you can. Actually, the government currently, or everything is collected for free. It's paying for the gas that's going to be the cost if you're actually collecting from people. But you cannot really pay for it because then you do this, or you create a self-selection bias where only poor people that want the money are going to provide information. And so that is counteractive to what you really want to create. And then for the AI thing, because the government really has a lot of people looking at these specifications and classifying in different categories, that's what you spend most of your time in when you're working as an analyst or as an economist, statistician. It's that, and then outlier detection, but that takes a lot of time. When you're scraping the data, there's going to be some data that's not going to be used, but it's just more efficient than hiring a bunch of people to just do that on a monthly basis. The government has the luxury of having way more money, but that's one of the reasons that we would use that. Sorry.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? We have one up there. Thank you.
Hey, what do you think about the quality of the current numbers from Western countries? Like United States or Europe, Germany, the official numbers?
I mean, for at least the US, I think they're pretty good, honestly. I think they're pretty good. They do publish, there's not just one CPI number, by the way, there's several. And the only thing is that you do have to go into each of the methodologies to really understand which one you want to use. And that is not easy to understand. It's also not as easy to claim that methodology is what was applied because we don't have access to the macro data. But having worked there for over a decade, I can assure you that at least the analysts, they're doing the best job that they can with the data that they receive because it's mostly cleaning it up. But a lot of the details are, the devil's in the details. So, for example, for the US, they didn't include any Blacks and Hispanic in the survey. So, did that really reflect inflation at the time? Probably not. And I think that's where the things go. Depending on how the survey is distributed, how it is actually asked. Even there's a whole science behind how you ask a specific survey question so that it doesn't bias one way or another. And I think they do have a lot of people that are trying to do their best at that. When there's political unrest, that's when I would probably say, I don't know, because you don't really know what kind of political coercion is actually being or exerted on that institution, on that governmental institution. And that's just really hard to measure. But yeah, I think.
Thank you so much once again, Brenda.
Thank you.
It's been amazing having you talk at DappCon. And yeah, another round of applause.
Thank you.